The head sat on the mantel like prized artworks. Only these weren't sculptures cast in bronze or marble busts commissioned by kings. They were real, severed, preserved. Some still bore traces of dried blood around lips he had kissed in the darkness of his private chambers. The most beautiful ones he kept for weeks, visiting them alone, speaking to their decomposing faces, admiring the way death transformed them into something he found sublime. This sounds like the twisted fantasy of a modern horror film, the kind of psychological nightmare that makes us grateful we live in civilized times. But this wasn't fiction. This was France in the 1430s, and the man collecting these trophies wasn't some shadowy outcast lurking in forgotten dungeons. He was Gilles de Rais, born in 1404 into unimaginable wealth, a national hero, the Marshal of France, a man who had fought beside Joan of Arc herself and commanded armies that liberated a nation. Before the term serial killer existed, before modern criminology gave us the language to understand such darkness, before anyone had words for sadistic pathology, the same terrifying patterns we associate with 20th century monsters were already present in this medieval nobleman. The keeping of trophies, the sexual gratification derived from killing, the selective targeting of victims based on their beauty, the ritualistic revisiting of corpses, even the fascination with anatomy, the compulsion to cut into flesh and see what lay beneath. And perhaps most disturbing of all, this killer wasn't hiding. He operated behind the stone walls of his castles for nearly a decade while poor children vanished from the surrounding villages, and no one could touch him because power protected him and fame blinded those who might have questioned. To understand how Gilles de Rais descended into such unfathomable darkness, we have to go back to 1404, to northwestern France, where a boy was born into a family whose wealth rivaled entire kingdoms. His full name was Gilles de Montmorency-Laval, later shortened to Gilles de Rais after the barony he would inherit. The countryside bore his family's crest on banners that flew from dozens of castles, and you might assume such privilege would guarantee a blessed life. But his world was built on blood, and it began spilling early. At just 11 years old, Gilles likely witnessed his father being mauled to death by a wild boar during a hunting accident. Soon after, his mother died, leaving him an orphan before he'd learned to wield a sword. His fate fell into the hands of his maternal grandfather, Jean de Crown, a man who would shape him into something both brilliant and monstrous. Jean didn't raise Gilles to be wise or compassionate. He raised him to be useful, power-hungry, calculating. Later, standing trial for unspeakable crimes, Gilles would blame his grandfather for raising him without discipline, allowing him to indulge every cruel whim, every corrupt instinct. And it wasn't just an excuse. Jean taught Gilles that nobility meant entitlement, that wealth justified cruelty, that the weak existed only to serve the strong. By 16, Gilles was displaying a chilling duality. On the surface he was gifted, fluent in Latin, well-read, charming enough to navigate the treacherous waters of French nobility. But underneath he was volatile, prone to bursts of rage and acts of violence that would one day terrify parents across the countryside. These same qualities made him a terrifying force on the battlefield, and his rise was meteoric. By 1427, at just 23 years old, Gilles was serving under the Dauphin, the future Charles VII, and France was in shambles. Battered by the 100 Years' War, with English forces occupying vast regions and French morale at rock bottom, then something extraordinary happened. A teenage girl appeared claiming divine visions, saying God had sent her to save France. Her name was Joan of Arc. Most nobles laughed. Gilles didn't. He was assigned to protect her in battle, to ensure she survived the coming chaos. And together they became legend. The siege of Orleans had dragged on for 6 brutal months when Joan and Gilles arrived. Within 4 days, the siege was shattered. Town after town fell under their combined leadership, and Gilles, always at the front, earned a reputation for unmatched courage. At just 25, in 1429, he was named Marshal of France, the highest military honor. But even as he was winning glory on blood-soaked battlefields, something inside him was shifting. Medieval warfare was grotesque beyond modern comprehension. Cities were pillaged, prisoners tortured, innocents slaughtered in ways that turned earth into charnel pits. Some historians believe this constant exposure to death and brutality awakened something already latent in Gilles, a darkness seeded in childhood now finally given permission to bloom. When Joan of Arc was captured by the Burgundians in 1430, Gilles made no attempt to rescue her. When she was burned at the stake in Rouen in 1431, he didn't even attend her execution. Instead, he disappeared from public life, retired to his estates, and what emerged in his place was something the world had never seen and would spend centuries trying to understand. Gilles began spending money with abandon that bordered on madness. He commissioned a grand theatrical production about the siege of Orleans, casting hundreds of actors and feeding every audience member for free, as if trying to recreate the glory days that had already slipped through his fingers. His household swelled to over 200 guards and servants, all dressed in luxury that drained his coffers daily. He commissioned art, music, illuminated manuscripts, but it was one particular project that raised eyebrows among those who still paid attention. In 1433, he built the Chapel of the Holy Innocents, its choir boys selected by Gilles himself for their voices and their beauty. The name was no accident. The Holy Innocents, a biblical reference to the children murdered by King Herod, a name that would take on grotesque irony just a few years later. As his wealth evaporated, his grip on reality seemed to slip, and in the villages surrounding his many castles, children began to disappear. At first the vanishings were dismissed as nothing unusual. Poor children went missing all the time, taken into servitude, claimed by disease, lost to the chaos of medieval life. But soon the pattern grew too disturbing to ignore. A farmer's apprentice lent to Gilles' cousin for an errand never returned. A merchant's son delivering fabrics to the castle gates was never seen again. The stories followed a similar script. A child would approach one of Gilles' strongholds, Macheco or Tifages, promised food or work or even education. Some were personally recruited by his servants, told they'd be joining the great lord's choir, and then nothing. They vanished as completely as if the earth had swallowed them whole. By 1435, whispers had turned to accusations, but who would dare confront the Marshal of France? Noblemen weren't questioned, and peasants had no voice that anyone in power would hear. Yet behind closed doors, fear took root and spread like plague. Eyewitnesses later claimed that dozens of small bodies were hauled from one of his estates under cover of night, burned in fire pits deep within the castle grounds where the smoke could dissipate before dawn. But still, no one moved against him. His power was too vast, his name too revered, his connections too deep. As his financial ruin deepened, Gilles turned from earthly pleasures to the occult, seeking salvation not from God but from demons. He brought in alchemists and mystics, desperate to restore his lost fortune through supernatural means. Among them was Francesco Prelati, a young Italian cleric who claimed he could summon demonic spirits, and who quickly became Gilles' most trusted confidant. The goal was simple in its horror. Summon a demon named Baron who, in exchange for sacrifices, would reveal the location of hidden treasure, and the sacrifices required specific components: the hand, the heart, the eyes, and the blood of a child. Suddenly, the murders took on a new dimension, not just acts of cruelty but acts of ritual performed with chilling intent. When Gilles finally confessed years later during his trial in 1440, the court was stunned not only by what he admitted but by the calm, almost surgical way he described it. The children would be lured, usually by promises of food or work. Once inside the castle walls, they were treated with kindness, sometimes bathed, clothed, even fed lavish meals. And then the nightmare would begin. He would comfort them, dry their tears, assure them they were safe, and then he would string them up from hooks embedded in the ceiling beams. Children hung by the neck until they passed out, revived, hung again. Sometimes this torture continued for hours. The child would beg, child would smile. Then came the killing. There were many methods: slitting throats, breaking necks with wooden rods, slowly severing with a sword called a brackmud. Sometimes Gilles watched from chairs positioned for the best view. Other times he participated directly, but the horror didn't end with death. He would dismember them, opening their bodies to marvel at their organs. He would kiss their dead mouths, caress their cooling skin. And when a child's face struck him as especially beautiful, he would sever the head and keep it, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks, displayed like art, visited, admired, even spoken to as if they could hear him. When the stench became unbearable, he would order the remains burned or buried in secret locations throughout his lands. The numbers defy belief. During his trial, when asked how many children he had killed, Gilles answered simply that he'd lost count. Officially, the court charged him with the deaths of 140 children. Some historians believe the number was closer to 200. Others argue it could have been 600 or more. No one truly knows because many bodies were reduced to ash. Others vanished into rivers or hidden pits never uncovered. But even with all this terror unfolding across nearly a decade, he remained free. The question that haunts historians is devastatingly simple. How? How did he escape justice for so long? The answer lies in the nature of medieval power. Gilles wasn't some outlaw hiding in forests. He was nobility, protected by titles, wealth, soldiers, and the unspoken rule that noblemen existed above the law that governed common people. It took a single miscalculation for that wall of protection to crack. In May of 1440, Gilles got into a property dispute with a local priest named Jean Laferin. Instead of settling it through legal channels, Gilles chose violence. He stormed the church with armed men and abducted Laferin mid-sermon, dragging him away at sword point in full view of the congregation. That act shattered any remaining protection. Even nobility couldn't excuse the violent seizure of a priest from holy ground. The Bishop of Nantes, who had long harbored suspicions, finally had the pretext he needed. In September of 1440, an armed force from the Duke of Brittany surrounded the castle of Machecola. Despite having hundreds of trained soldiers at his command, didn't resist. He simply walked out and surrendered, as if he knew the game was over, as if some part of him had been waiting for the moment when justice or damnation would finally arrive. What followed was one of the most chilling trials in medieval history. Two parallel courts, one secular and one ecclesiastical, moved swiftly with clear aims. When 49 articles of charges were read, ranging from ritual murder to summoning demons, Gilles was combative at first, mocking the judges, sneering at their authority. The church responded by excommunicating him, stripping him of the right to receive sacraments or be buried in consecrated ground. For a nobleman of the 15th century, this meant eternal damnation, and that finally broke him. On October 15, 1440, he appeared before the court a changed man, apologizing and agreeing to confess. But it was the threat of torture on October 20th that unraveled him completely. He agreed to confess fully, and what poured out over the following days sent ripples through history that still echo today. He described in graphic, articulate detail the murders of dozens, possibly hundreds of children. He wept as he spoke, not from madness but with the precise, clear recollection of a man who knew exactly what he had done. His accomplices, Henriette and Poitou, were brought before the court, and they too confessed, their testimonies mirroring Gilles's in nearly every horrifying detail. On October 26, 1440, thousands gathered in the meadow outside Nantes to witness the execution. Gilles arrived dressed in white, the color of repentance. He spoke of forgiveness and begged parents to raise their children strictly, blaming his descent into depravity on the leniency of his own upbringing. He asked that his servants be executed after him so they would not fear their fate. The crowd watched in grim stillness as the noose was placed around his neck. Without ceremony, the platform dropped. Gilles de Rais died not with screams but with silence. His body was quickly cut down and placed on a pyre, but as promised, the flames were stopped before they could consume him fully so he could receive Christian burial. His servants were not so fortunate. Their bodies were left in the fire until nothing remained but ash. It could have ended there, a monster caught and justice served. But in the centuries that followed, historians and legal scholars returned to this case again and again, not to marvel at his evil but to ask an uncomfortable question. What if the confessions were lies extracted under threat? What if the accusations were crafted not to punish evil but to seize power and land? In 1992, over 500 years later, a group of French scholars held a symbolic retrial using modern standards of justice. Their verdict, not guilty due to insufficient evidence and suspicious motives among his accusers. The truth, like so many truths buried in medieval darkness, may never be fully known. Was Gilles de Rais history's first documented serial killer, a monster who preyed on innocents behind castle walls? Or was he a wealthy nobleman destroyed by enemies who used the perfect crime to mask their theft of his lands? Perhaps the most terrifying answer is that both can be true. That evil and corruption can exist simultaneously. That monsters can be made into scapegoats, and scapegoats can also be monsters. What remains certain is this. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of children vanished during those years, and their names have been lost to time while his has endured. They were the holy innocents, not the ones commemorated in his chapel, but the ones whose voices were silenced forever in rooms where no one could hear them scream. And whether Gilles de Rais was their killer or merely the most convenient villain in a medieval power play, those children deserved better than to become footnotes in a controversy that outlived them by 6 centuries.